Good afternoon, everyone, and a happy Year of the Tiger to those who are celebrating. My name is Jean Oy. I'm the director of the China program in Shorenstein APARC. And today we're very privileged to have a special talk on Xinjiang by Professor James Millward. I know that many of you are quite concerned about what is happening in Xinjiang province. And there have been many reports of mass detentions, re-education camps, forced labor, destruction of mosques, and more. And I think particularly now, internationally, there have been policies that have led to scrutiny of global supply chains for Xinjiang-made materials. There are now US sanctions and congressional inquiries, and most recently, with the Olympics coming up, there are diplomatic boycotts of the Olympics. And so today we are very pleased to have one of the foremost experts on Xinjiang, Professor James Millward, he will be giving us an update about what is happening now in Xinjiang and share his insights. I think he's going to also, and I think very usefully, start with a bit of historical context. Professor Millward is actually a Stanford product. We're proud to claim him. He got his degree here at Stanford, working with Hel Khan and Lyman Van Slyke. He taught at Arizona after his degree, and then started at Georgetown in '96, and he's been there ever since. He is the professor of intersocietal history at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. But we're also very pleased, and the reason we have him actually is that he is a visiting scholar at APARC for this winter quarter. He has published a number of very important books, including a book on the Silk Road. There's books on the Qing. But I think today is going to be talking on a updated and expanded version of his book, Eurasian Crossroads, The History of Xinjiang, that just came out, a new version, I think a couple of months ago. So this is a great opportunity for us, and we will look forward to it. I want to note that we will be taking Q&A. Professor Millward will be speaking for approximately half an hour, 35 minutes or so, and then we'll do questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and I will curate the questions and pose them to Professor Millward. So with that, I'm not going to take up any more time and turn it over to you, Jim.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Oy. I'm very pleased to be here at Stanford and pleased to be giving this talk today, although it is on a somber subject. I'm going to, I've got some slides, and this is a kind of texty, kind of information heavy talk, at least for some parts of it. And I've put a lot of information into my slides themselves. If anyone's interested, by the way, I can send a PDF of this or make one available that you can get at a later date. Okay, so anyway, you should be seeing my slides now. I'm going to begin, well, what I'll do in the next half an hour or so, I'm going to give a sort of brief historical background going back to the 18th century, but speeding through it, and then talk about what's happened in the last few years, and then come back around and try to contextualize and understand and interpret, or give you my sense of why we have a crisis in Xinjiang right now and what it's about. But I think this historical, the sort of longer historical framing, and particularly in the way I'm about to do it, which may be a little different from what you've heard before, I think that's important for understanding this. So as you know, the Qing Empire conquered the region, the northern part known as Jungaria, the southern part known as Altashar, and it was quite successful as empires go. And one of the signs we have for this, is that the population increased and the economy was doing quite well. They were growing cotton there to make cloth, to trade with nomads, to get livestock, to support the military, and that sort of thing. There were invasions from Central Asia and revanchist interests from some of the previous rulers in the region, a lineage of Sufi saints. In the early 19th century, after a series of those invasions, the Qing decided to open up southern Xinjiang to Han settlement. And there was a whole debate as to whether they should just pull out of southern Xinjiang altogether, or what to do about this problem. So they opened it up to settlement. And this is a recurring theme in the security of the region from states based in China, based in Beijing. The turn to settler colonialism as an approach to security issues or perceived security issues. It came up again in writings of the statesman Gong Zizhen in the 19th century. And then Zhuo Zongtang, after overseeing the reconquest in the late 19th century of the region, likewise promoted extensive Han settlement. The idea being Han will grow, Han farmers going out there will make the desert bloom, they can be taxed. This will provide a revenue source so that the center doesn't have to subsidize their control out there. And in that way, both make it cheaper to control Xinjiang because it required these subsidies year after year, and then also make it more secure. Okay, so 1911, 1912, as you know, the Qing Empire collapsed. And this is a context we don't normally think about when we think about the fall of the Qing, but I think it's worthwhile remembering that the Romanov or the Tsarist Empire collapsed in 1917, the Habsburg or the Austria-Hungary Empire collapsed the next year, the Ottoman collapsed. So all of these big land empires in Eurasia were collapsing at that time. And this had a similar effect everywhere, namely that there was splintering of different peoples in the context of nationalist ideology, which had been spreading for some time. And as we saw in parts of Western Eurasia, in Europe and in the Middle East and elsewhere, there were declarations of independent states, of new nations coming out of on the ruins of the former empire. So Tibet and Mongolia declared independence in 1912. And of course, as we know, this is the story of the republics of China in the 20th century. The Han likewise declared independence as a nation state from this former empire. And then over the next couple of decades, there were various efforts to do this in Xinjiang as well, by Muslim Hui, by Turkic groups. The famous Eastern Turkestan republics, one in the early 30s, the other in the 1940s did so. Sun Yat-sen, in one of his books, this one called I'm blocking on the name, the International Development of China. It was sort of a companion volume to his Sanmin Zhui, to his Three People's Principles. He has a whole chapter on the colonization of Mongolia and Xinjiang and Manchuria. This colonization was not an evil word early in the 20th century, really, for anyone. It was being used quite commonly. It was seen as a legitimate aspiration. And interestingly, Sun's program was really very similar to those that had been outlined before and those that have been outlined since, that involved settler colonialism, moving of Han, demobilization of troops in the region as well. Okay, but the Kuomintang didn't really have much power in Xinjiang until the 1940s, when they took over from a Soviet-sponsored warlord, Sheng Shicai. And then very quickly after that, war broke out with a state in the northern part of Xinjiang, the Eastern Turkestan Republic, that was sponsored by the Soviet Union. And the ETR was poised to take Urumqi, and then international politics intervened. And so in August of 1945, in the aftermath or the near aftermath of World War II, the US intervened with the Kuomintang and the Soviets intervened with the Eastern Turkestan Republic, and they patched it up and agreed to govern Xinjiang in a kind of condominium with Eastern Turkestan Republic officials, including Ahmed Kasemi, the president of the Eastern Turkestan Republic, ruling together with a Kuomintang governor in the region. And there was a lot of influence of this Turkic socialist state there at this time. And what are seen as liberal policies, so ethnic quotas, representative elections, institutional and administrative involvement of non-Han peoples and so on. Okay, so in 1949, following the Guomindang surrender, Chiang Kai-shek at this point already in Taiwan, or about to get there, sent orders to his generals out in Xinjiang, where part of the Guomindang army had retreated, to fight against the communist bandits to the death. And they said, well, no, I don't think so, and handed over the keys, essentially, to southern Xinjiang, to the Red Army as it came marching in. The communist forces then secured the southern part and then moved more gradually into the northern part of Xinjiang. All were socialist allies, of course, at this point. The Socialist Eastern Turkestan Republic in the north, with strong Soviet influence. But it was a tricky transition, and as I've written here, what ultimately happened was that the former leadership, including Ahmed Khasami, of the Eastern Turkestan Republic, they were flying to Beijing to join the People's Political Consultative Conference, and their plane disappeared over Mongolia. And so new non-Han leadership were installed at that point. And then the leaders of the former ETR were enshrined as heroes of the revolution, and the so-called Three Districts Revolution for the three districts of northern Xinjiang was written into the history of the Chinese Revolution officially, and there was a monument commemorating their heroic role in that, set up in northern Xinjiang, in Ili as well. And then the new administration, the PRC in Xinjiang, began to colonize the region by settling these Guomindang troops, along with another 20,000 or so PLA troops. So some 100,000 soldiers were then settled in the state farms, which then became the Bingtuan. This became the Xinjiang Production Construction Corps, or Construction Military Corps. I like to say it that way to make sure that the Bing is represented in the translation. And there were subsequent waves of Han settlement as well, and particularly in the Cultural Revolution, and so on. And of course, Xinjiang was one of the places where the new Minzu system and then the autonomous regions system were particularly important. And I call this the diversity regime of the PRC. The reason is that the reason why it was necessary to have this system of top-down recognized ethnic groups modeled in part upon that of the Soviet Union, although with some significant differences. I think one way of looking at this is simply, the PRC was now again in control of most of the former Qing Empire. So how do you govern as a socialist state? How do you control a former empire without looking like an imperialist or colonialist yourself? And so implementing this system with self-rule, at least in theory, and recognizing the other nations besides the Han, or the other nationalities besides the Han, was this really the core elements of this PRC diversity regime. All right, so I'm going to jump over the next 60, 70 years or so. We'll sort of come back around to that, but to get to the main topic today and that's what's been happening recently. And many of you, if you're tuning in today, then you're probably pretty aware about all of this. So I won't linger on, and I can go into more details in the questions later if you'd like to. I want to extend the timeline a little bit further, though. It isn't simply from 2016, 2017, from the arrival of Chen Quanguo as first party secretary in Xinjiang, but even before that, from at least 2009 or 2010, and maybe even a little bit earlier, I think you can see the signs of what's coming later, at least the trajectory, if not the same intensity. In particular, in the official discouragement of many aspects of Uyghur culture, particularly religious aspects, and actual destruction of cultural heritage, in particular, the tearing down of old Kashgar, which was of great concern to people all over the region because of Kashgar's role and the tradition as a center of Uyghur culture. And it was torn down ostensibly for urban renewal purposes. There were developers involved. It may not, in fact, even have been a state-directed program so much as part of the same kind of thing going on, tearing down of historical buildings all over China. But it had a very strong and sort of different effect. And then discouragement of aspects of Islamic culture, destruction of mosques and shrines, which has ramped up in more recent years, a scrutiny officially of Uyghur entertainment or social practices, nulkam music and meshrab, concerned about textbooks. I'll come back to that later on. Okay, and then I just will sort of pause here at this picture. If anyone's been to Kashgar in recent years, since the building up of this new kind of simulacrum, the Disneyfied version of Kashgar, you're familiar with this tableau where tourists go out and they are treated to the dance and music and so on. If you Google Kashgar and hit images, you will get a million versions of this from a million tourists who've been there. But I think it's interesting, particularly these figures arrayed along the top of this fake wall, of this fake gate, because they are, there's not 8 of them, but they are dressed up as Qing bannermen. And so they're the military guard over this scene. So they're recreating a Qing imperial scene here. So it really is an imperial tableau, which is used to welcome tourists to this new touristified Kashgar. All right, so and then as probably you heard if you were reading the news, a surveillance regime has been implemented based on AI and high tech, the mobile phone being the fulcrum of that, and with involvement of really many Chinese tech companies, but also global technology being part of that as well. Darren Byler has written a wonderful book which focuses on this and explains it in detail. There's a database, the Integrated Joint Military Operations Platform, into which biodata and data about travel and prayer practices and one's relatives and all sorts of other things were all loaded. And then that database and an algorithm could be crunched on that database, which then pinged out hits of people who were deemed to be liable to extremism. Of course, having WhatsApp on your phone or a VPN was one of the main things that was caught through this digital scrutiny, and particularly through the frequent scanning of cell phones. And then that process then resulted in the internments that you've read about, and also mass arrests into programs known as Jiaoyu Zhuanhua, educational transformation, but in facilities that we know from leaked documents are, at least at the most extreme end, prison-like. They're prisons, essentially. And there were softer versions too. There's sort of a day school version where you only spend the day and you get to go home at night, but several tiers of this kind of treatment. But some up to 1 to 2 million people involved in that, rolled into that, mainly non-Han, not just Uyghurs, but Kazakhs, some Hui, and others. Now, less well known, though, is that there was also a massive increase of arrests through the regular legal system in these same years. Something like 25% of all prosecutions in China were taking place in 2017 and 2018 in Xinjiang. And there's some graphical representations of this. So here you see the huge uptick between 2016, when Chen Quanguo got to the region, and then they started implementing this. An additional 200,000 people suddenly arrested over the baseline of previous years. This gives us the next year as well, 2018. And this same kind of pattern is reflected in other institutions as well. You see the new security facilities that were built. These are mainly camps and detention centers. This one's quite chilling. These are yoaryuet, so kindergartens or daycare centers, really. And you see that their numbers increased right at the same time that the numbers of arrests and internments increased. And this is, of course, this place, children whose parents were taken away needed some place to go. And it was also part of the broader plan. As we can see here, students' dormitories here for slightly older children, grades 1 through 9, likewise were increased in those same years. As a result of the ramping up of birth suppression campaigns, and this involved, even though for many of the non-Han people, they had a higher quota at that point than some Han. So 2 children were allowed to urban Uyghur families. It was being very strictly enforced, much more so than the limits were enforced elsewhere in China, with coerced insertions of IUDs, enforced sterilization being very, very common. And you can see from, again, this is from public source materials, public source records, you can see that red line is the Uyghur population. I'm sorry, that's Xinjiang birth rates generally dropping off a cliff around 2017 to 2018. And the numbers in counties that are primarily Uyghur is even more steep. This includes the north part of Xinjiang as well. Here's just another indicator. You can see way over there on the left, with birth rates going down by 50%, what an outlier Xinjiang is from the rest of China at that point. The forced labor or labor transfers, the way that those of us who are working on Xinjiang think about this is that there had been labor transfers before. There had been programs to assist unemployed Uyghurs, particularly from the poor rural south, to find jobs before. After the implementation of the camp system, however, when your local officials would come to you and say, we want you to go work 600 miles away in a factory, or you're going to be assigned here, even if you weren't already in a camp, it became impossible under those conditions to say no to such transfers. And then, of course, there were direct transfers of people from the internment camps to factories, often adjacent to the camps, or in particular in relatively recently built industrial parks and satellite factories, which were built under the partnership program funded by 18 provinces and cities from Eastern China. So this is the way in which the internment system and the forced labor system actually does directly involve places such as Shenzhen and Dongguan and Shanghai and Beijing and Tianjin and Anhui province and others. It hasn't fully been understood yet, but they're deeply involved in this, I fear. All right, trying to keep an eye on the time. Family separation, of course, resulted from this. This is another reason why birth rates went down. Interestingly, in 2019, a new set of standards for the Gaokao, this is college admissions test, and of extra bonus points, a new policy about that was rolled out. And this is a very sensitive issue. I think one of the things you hear most often from Chinese people, probably the largest source of resentment, I think, of minorities generally, is that one could have more than the limited number of children, but then secondly, they would get bonus points and other kinds of affirmative action and help for university admission. And so this is an interesting change in that it used to be there were extra points given to minorities and those in poor areas. In 2019, they changed it so that the highest number of bonus points goes to the offspring of families with one Han person and one Xinjiang minority parent, one Han parent and one Xinjiang minority parent, or for Han who are majoring in one of the languages of Xinjiang. And then the minority children were only getting 15 points after that. So this shows what kind of the point of these university incentives are. The state wants to train up people with capabilities in Xinjiang non-Han languages. And of course, here they're also trying to encourage miscegenation with Han. If a Kazakh and a Uyghur were married, their children wouldn't get the special points. But this is kind of an indication of what kind of social engineering the state is interested in. All right, and the pressure on Uyghurs outside of China, as you can imagine. International reaction. People started realizing this already from around 2018 because friends and relatives were disappearing or deleting contacts and just dropping off the map. There were efforts to call this out in parts of the UN, but at that point, the US was not on the UN Human Rights Council. And this, because of the Trump administration's concern over the Palestine issue, he'd pulled the US out. And so the US was not in a position to help manage the raising of this issue on the Human Rights Council. And when a group of democratic countries wrote a letter to the council about this, the PRC was able to gather together a larger group of supporting countries to respond to that letter. It's often said that there, you often say, why haven't Muslim countries responded more to this? And indeed, they haven't. There have been popular demonstrations in some places, but not a across the board expression of outrage on the part of the Islamic world. We can talk about this more later on, but that expectation, I think, is a little unrealistic and also reflects a poor understanding, I think, of Islam in general. But the biggest common denominator of those countries supporting the PRC in this is low human rights scores, very, very authoritarian governments and very poor record on human rights, rather than whether they're Muslim countries or non-Muslim countries. Corporations, the cotton issue, of course, has entangled many corporations in this. Now, the Trump administration belatedly started implementing some sanctions. It was his national security advisor, John Bolton, in his tell-all memoir, mentions that Trump, while meeting on the sidelines of the Osaka G20 in 2019, had green-lighted the idea of the camps to Xi Jinping directly. I think it's worth underscoring that because the Trump administration gets credit for being tough on China, but on this issue, he was not tough. Until after COVID, there was a flip. And from then on, as many of you here will know, there was a series of measures rolled out by the Trump administration, including the China initiative, or ramping up the China initiative, and targeting of Chinese and people of Chinese origin in universities and all of that. And they were joking in the White House that this was China Week, is what they called this. Now, the fact that the targeted Xinjiang sanctions are caught up in that raft of anti-China actions, under that kind of broad brush idea, has been problematic, because it's been easy to argue that concern about what's going on in Xinjiang is part of US-China rivalry in general. And in particular, this has been a complaint or an argument from the left, I guess. And I think it's unfair and inaccurate, but that's how all these things came out. Series of sanctions, entities list, global Magnitsky, and these have been repeated and built upon by the Biden administration, generally quite targeted. One can argue that their impacts are more symbolic than actually causing pain. Maybe we'll talk about this more later on. Even symbolic impacts are important to make clear the reputational costs of the Xinjiang policies. And of course, broadening them, as the Biden administration has done, and getting coordination from the EU, Canada, Australia, I think the UK for some of these as well, is very important. There have been various findings by governments and parliaments and non-governmental groups of genocide. Human Rights Watch has determined that what's going on are crimes against humanity, and then 2 congressional bills including the Forced Labor Prevention Act passed just a couple months ago. Okay, so why? Why is this happening, and why is it happening? Is this happening now? It is still thought, and of course this is the argument from the People's Republic of China, that these measures, draconian as they are, were necessary to deal with the problem of pervasive extremism, religious-based extremism, and terrorism was going on in Xinjiang before the implementation of these policies in 2016 and 2017. That argument gets some traction, I think, because really we spent a lot of the last 20 years talking about terrorism among the Uyghurs and in Xinjiang under this rubric of the global war on terror, which of course was really the organizing principle for American foreign policy from 9/11 really through the beginning of the Obama administration. The US, as part of trying to get China to agree to the UN resolution authorizing the invasion of Iraq, the US had listed one of a Uyghur group, a very small Uyghur group based in Afghanistan, as an international terrorist organization. A lot of problems with that. Sean Roberts' book, The War on the Uyghurs, goes into that in great detail. He talked to those people and others, and it really explodes what has been a pervasive story, that there was this smoldering powder keg of terrorism, of religious extremism in Xinjiang for years. There were 4 incidents after a long hiatus, well, from around 2010 or so, there had been violence, particularly in rural, poor areas of southern Xinjiang. All of it, of course, is called terrorism in Chinese sources. But a lot of it was the sort of thing of, a fight breaks out in a home, in a Uyghur home, when the police come in and are actively deveiling women, things like that. Much of the violence was in response to intrusive policing of religion. It has religion in there, so it seems associated with religion, but it's really more in reaction to the state cracking down on religion per se. A lot of these events, you can read the public announcements, and they'll say, oh, well, in this, 60 terrorists were killed when they attacked a police station, and 4 police officers. I'm making these numbers up, but they're representative of a lot of these kinds of events. And so, is that a terrorist act? It's definitely unrest, but it's suggesting different sorts of sources. Now, the 4 incidents in 2013 to 2014, including Kunming, 2 events in Urumqi, and the driving of a vehicle, of a SUV on Tiananmen Square and hitting some people and bursting into flames. Those do fit the model, the sort of Salafi template of random attacks on random civilians to make a political point. And those do fit that. But they don't show broader organization. They don't show international involvement that we can tell, or that's been reported. And ultimately, the casualties are in the range of dozens, as are the numbers of people involved. The PRC state talks about the 3 evils, and this has been kind of the slogan for a long time. And as a slogan, it's also an explanation, right? It's a rationalization for policies, and it's an explanation of why this unrest is supposed to be going on. I think it's worth kind of looking at that. The terrorism argument definitely doesn't hold water as an existential threat at the kind of scale that they imply. Most of the unrest is not due to religion, quite clearly, and most serious events, such as the Urumqi events of July of 2009, are clearly unrelated to religion. But lately, it's occurred to me that even the claim that separatism is behind this, we really don't know, because you never get to interview or even see an interview with anyone who does any of these things, right? They're either dead or they're put away in prison. We don't know their names most of the time. And separatism is, thrown around, as an evil. And yet there are lots of separatist issues all around the world. Quebec, Catalan in the Basque country, Ireland, and sometimes they turn violent, sometimes they haven't. But separatism in and of itself, we should really think twice about calling it an evil in and of itself. It certainly is within the PRC sort of mindset, but you ought to sort of stop and think, why are people wanting to separate, if indeed they are wanting to separate? I think there's another possibility for reasons behind this. Besides simply reaction to an increasingly anti-religious state, and a state that is profiling non-Han peoples again and again and sort of locking them up digitally like this, simply besides those kind of reactions, one thing that you never hear talk about in Xinjiang is of the kind of mass incidents that are talked about. Oh, and I think another 5 minutes or so. Okay, thank you, Callista. I don't know when you sent that though, so I'll wrap up quite quickly. The kind of mass incidents that we're told there are tens of thousands of across China annually, right? That are never called terrorism there. Are we to understand that there are none, and they have to do with local malfeasance by officials or by rapacious businessmen, environmental issues, things like that. Problems with factory governance, all of these kind of things, land expropriation, right? There's a lot of those things going on. And these sort of mass incidents in which the central party comes in and resolves the problems, they're, that's seen as kind of an escape valve, right? We're never told that anything like that happens in Xinjiang. So are we to understand that Xinjiang is uniquely well governed compared to other provinces of China? And that the only incidents that happen are religious inspired or terrorist? That's basically the story that we're being told. All right. So I would argue that there are broader reasons, and that we really need to recognize that the colonial condition of governance in Xinjiang, and you could extend that in some ways to Tibet, Mongolia, and even Hong Kong, I think now. Just saying it's due to religion and due to foreign influences infecting people like a virus, that's clearly not a good diagnosis of the problem. There's very clear settler colonialization going on. Much of the vaunted expenditures and subsidies going into Xinjiang actually have gone to support the security state. They've gone to develop extractive industries. They've been particularly gone to the Bingtuan, or the Xinjiang Production Construction Corps, which runs at a huge loss and has done for decades. And all of this is really ironic and sad, I think, because I'm one of the ones who thinks that there was something good, at least good possibilities in the Minzu system, in the regional autonomy system. If we think beyond that, if we think about one country, two systems, or the special autonomous region of Hong Kong, or even special economic zones, which led to Shenzhen's tremendous growth in the beginnings of the reform era. The PRC really has had an interesting creativity and flexibility on these issues of parceling out autonomy, parceling out different kinds of administration. It really is pluralist without being democratic, and has been. And in many ways, particularly in the 1950s, was much more liberal with regard to ethnic relationships, ethnic interrelations than the United States, certainly. Right? So I think the reversal of this that we've seen in recent years is ironic and quite sad. And I'm going to stop right there. I'll stop sharing my screen and we can go to questions and answers. I have a little bit more to say, but I'll bring that in later on if I can.
If you want, Jim, you can go ahead and just take a couple more minutes.
Can I do that? Okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to talk to
No,
everyone
go
here.
ahead.
I actually have really only one more, I think one more slide.
Go ahead. Go ahead, finish.
Okay. All right, good. All right, so I had a couple more, but all right. It's interesting to think about this change, this reversal of previous approaches to ethnicity or to diversity regime in the PRC, and to kind of hold that up against some of the broader trends of Xi Jinping's party and Xi Jinping's China, right? There has been obviously a very nationalistic turn, which is often talked about. There's been a focus on this idea of the Zhonghua Minzu, which I'm arguing is really, when you break it down, it's not very different from Han. And I think you can find points of intersection between that and the China Dream, Confucian revival, the Sinicization of religion, and so on. There's a phrase that's been bandied about, one of these catchphrases that emerged in a Xi Jinping speech, but then gets repeated, which suggests to us that it's quite important. And I've written it out here to take firmly casting the Zhonghua collective consciousness as the main line. In other words, to stress this idea of forging, as you would cast a steel ingot, right? This collective consciousness of Zhonghua. Now that's very different from the Maoist idea of Minzu Tuanjie. Right? Unity of nationalities involves being united, standing together, while nonetheless maintaining distinctive identities, right? Whereas melting somebody down and melting your ethnicities down into a blast furnace into a new collective consciousness is like, it's taking the melting pot idea, formally espoused in the United States and influential on some ideologues and anthropologists in China, but it's taking that and sort of bumping it up to industrial strength, right? So that's quite an indicative line. And then in speeches about several problems on the history of Xinjiang, which is of course literally laying down what the official narrative of Xinjiang will be, beginning in a secret speech in 2017, but then showing up in other people's talks and op-eds later on, is this line which I think is quite intriguing, simply saying that all of the Minzu of Xinjiang are family members connected to the bloodlines of Zhonghua, okay, throughout time. Now, might be reading too much into this, but the evocation of the idea of bloodlines, of course, makes one think that this is a racial or racialist argument being made. And when you put it together with an editorial, for example, by the Uyghur mayor of Urumqi, who was saying that Uyghurs are not descended from the Tujue, they're not descended from the Turkic peoples, but they are in fact descended from Zhonghua, right? This is a different kind of argument. It's saying that everyone is Zhonghua from ancient times, and that, right? And even racially, or at least implying that, insinuating it into the discourse. And it's quite different from the way Fei Xiaotong, who came up with this formula, Duoya and Iti. So many origins, one body. And the way he talked about Minzu in China was that there were the 56 Minzu, and there was the Zhonghua Minzu as a political identity that emerged through historical processes and under the guidance of the Chinese Communist Party, out of all of the others, but emerged as almost a modern phenomenon. That's very different from saying that everyone has been Zhonghua all along, whether they know it or not, which is what this phrase seems to apply to me. And then just a few more kind of speculative points about why this might be happening now. She definitely seems to be someone who wants to centralize control. This idea of centralization of power has always rested uncomfortably with the idea of giving autonomy to non-Han groups, or autonomy in general, or self-rule in provinces generally. If you're a pop psychologist and you want to think about his relationship to his father, then to what extent is this a different approach than Xi Jinping's famous and perhaps exaggerated tolerance and interest of minorities, particularly Tibetans? The Xi Jinping scholars will argue about that. One thing that has an enabling cause, I think, has been the fact that all of the technology has become practicable, from facial recognition to being able to scan retroactively people's voice messages in Uyghur, right, and have machines do this, so you can go through people's phones by the millions. They've become practical, and of course have been bumped up to greater efficiency in the crucible of Xinjiang, with tons of state investment, which allows all of the firms to go in there and develop their technology, and in particular to train their algorithms with very, very large sample sizes and very, very large amounts of big data. And that's something to think about going forward for the rest of China, and of course for the world. And of course, it's not alone that this is happening in China. It's happening, of course, with Google and Facebook and everyone else as well. This does seem to be the Chinese expression of a global wave of nativism or supremacy of some sort. I play around with trying to think about how this global wave is connected, if it is. Certainly, Islamophobia fuels a lot of it in a lot of places. So that's something worth thinking about. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jim. That was very, very informative. And I'm very glad that you actually took the historical view, because I think it is very important. And I actually would want to start with your last few slides, because I think it's very interesting and sort of ironic that we think about the Mao period, as a period of much more harsh controls on people as a whole. But in many ways, what you were saying, that during that period, that policies in Xinjiang toward the minorities was actually much less, quite different than they are now, and that they had more room. There wasn't the focus on assimilation. They didn't even do much to try to get them to learn Chinese, Mandarin. So I guess this is what your slides at the end were getting at. So it's interesting, the question of like what really is behind this change. And so you talk about this terrorism, but does this mean that the mechanisms of control that were able to, there were always ethnic tensions, throughout the whole period, right? It's just that they never sort of rose to the level of whatever, I'm not sure what to call it. But so is this saying something about the change in the effectiveness of earlier control mechanisms, or is it really sort of this global, what you calling, this war on terror, that really is the mechanism that is driving this?
So first of all, yeah, about the Maoist period. So I didn't state this, that the Cultural Revolution, or sort of the 10-year Cultural Revolution, was the exception, and then it was not a good time to be a minority in Xinjiang or anywhere. And you get the pigs in the mosques as you got destruction of monasteries in Tibet and so on and so forth. So we kind of bracket that out. And the 50s and the 80s are considered sort of the golden age of the Minzu system, particularly the 80s after Hu Yaobang came in with much more deliberately, as part of a way of atoning for the sins and for the non-development of Xinjiang and Tibet. He was, some say, many say in PRC now, he went too far, right? Being soft on minorities, quote unquote. But so to answer your broader question, I think there's both longer term continuities and processes, and then proximate discontinuities and causes for this. Longer term, I think, is this general tension about basically the unfulfilled and from the CCP's point of view, unfulfillable promise of autonomy, but with the expectations that that vocabulary creates, and then also that periods like the 1980s create, right? So that is an ongoing tension, and so some of the swings back and forth are due to that. And then there's a long-term process of repression, reaction, repression, reaction, and we can really mark that, I think, beginning in 1990 with an incident known as the Bahrain incident, which was a small-scale, relatively small-scale uprising, but it had a religious overtone, and it was organized by someone who had a religious school, right, and students from that and others. So that, freaked out the party. They probably overreacted, but that was precisely the sorts of things that they were most worried about, was religious-based organization. But it's important to note that, so in the 90s, there were a few of these sorts of incidents, some religious, there were bombings of buses we don't know much about in 1992. There was a big event in 1997, but that was not particularly religious. It was a protest march that was then repressed. And then there was 10 years where nothing happened, right? And so the problem with the powder keg or the simmering cauldron kind of models, which particularly the think tanks and those who started looking for Islamic terrorism in Xinjiang, they see this as an ongoing trajectory. How do you explain that 10 years when it wasn't happening, right?
Exactly.
All right. So
right.
then we get up to the Olympics, 2008, around then, and there were a couple of events, around that time, and then 2009, the so-called Qiwu Shijian, the Urumqi event, and that was huge, and that was another one of these big events that the state felt it needed to respond to. So I would say that 2009 is really the inflection point that we should sort of look to, and then track the state policies and popular responses and things like this. And of course, that was already happening in the context of global war on terror. And after 2001, the CCP had changed its way of talking about ethnic problems in Xinjiang to be almost exclusively in the context, in the framework of Islamic terrorism, of extremism like that.
So there's also a lot of interesting questions. Maybe one that will be useful is this from Tom Finger, and he was wondering, how does the treatment of other minorities in Xinjiang compare to the treatment of Uyghurs? Mm-hmm. And also there's a related question about, about birth control. So in Xinjiang, so now do all ethnic groups, including the Uyghurs, are they allowed to have more children under the dismantling of the one-child policy?
Right. So, so the first question is, in particular, the crackdown on so-called extremism and the use of the camps and so-called educational transformation. That has affected Kazakhs very seriously as well. It's affected Hui. There's a young woman who is actually a student at University of Washington who was back visiting her boyfriend, and she got pinged by the system going somewhere where she wasn't supposed to go, and she was pinged on the basis of her phone, and she ended up spending a very long time in one of these camps. So it has been for the Xinjiang groups and some Mongol minorities and others. They've all had to be on high alert, particularly the Muslim groups, and so they haven't escaped it. Obviously, some Uyghurs most. As far as the birth system, right? So it's complicated by the fact that the controls on births for the limits on births for Han have been changed from 1 to 2, for urban Han from 1 to 2, and then now from 2 to 3, right? It looks like it's been dismantled. The limit had always been for Uyghurs 2, even for urban Uyghurs. Right. So the first change, I think, was 2015, or it simply reduced the Han limits to those that the Uyghurs had. But it's enforcement that matters, and that's been the difference. And they're still, as far as I can tell, enforcing it very, very severely. Most chilling about that, and this came out in the recently released so-called Xinjiang papers, which had some speeches by Xi Jinping and others from 2014 already, is already in 2014, the Beijing leadership was talking about optimizing population, so 人口优化 or 优化人口, right? By which they meant, and it's very explicit, the relative proportion of Han to non-Han, or of Uyghurs to non-Han in the region that needed to be changed. And there needed to be fewer Uyghurs relative to Han in the region. And that's clearly been the reason for this zealous implementation of the birth control policies.
Actually, that was one of the questions that came in, was the Renko Yohan. Let me also ask you, because a lot of this, in terms of when it occurs, and you did talk about Chenguangs. So how much of this do you think we can attribute to someone like Chen, who was also quite brutal in Tibet? Because then also the fact that I just read a report not long ago that he's going to be leaving and he's going to be replaced.
Yeah.
And so do you think that is going to make a difference? And also, what does this signal?
Right. So the policies quite clearly come from the top, and the mandates to do something about this. Chun was brought in from Tibet, where he had been first party secretary, and had a reputation of being a fixer of these kinds of problems. He was clearly brought in to fix them. But this isn't a case of local official, exceeding his brief or anything like that. It was clear that he was implementing and seeking the goals very explicitly asked for. And this is why these Xinjiang papers are important, because it makes it clear, even before Chen got there, that people were talking along these lines and planning a kind of re-engineering of ethnicity that we're seeing these camps are trying to do. Now, the fact that he's leaving, I read quite a bit about that when it was announced. I'm not an expert on elite Chinese politics by any means. I should toss the question back to you. But what I've read is simply that 5 years as first party secretary at the regional provincial level is pretty normal. And given his age, this would be about the time when if he were going to move to something else, he would move. So the transfer is not seen as any kind of party commentary about his performance, and it's definitely not seen as a rebuke. Now, depends kind of what next position he gets. Some are saying he could end up even on the standing committee, which would definitely be the opposite of a rebuke. So it's not clear what his next position will be. His successor, Ma, I can't remember if
from Guangdong,
Ma Xingru or something, from Guangdong. So he has kind of a different sort of fixer reputation, sort of more of an economic portfolio that he's been good at doing. So that may be meant to signal, okay, we've solved the problem. Now we're going to get development back, back online and start focusing on the economy again. But certainly, I don't think it means any. They're not swinging back. They're not going to lift the boot off of the neck. They've got the digital system in place. You don't need so many police cops on the street to do it now. They can simply control it through digital means, and with the threat of the camps still there. No one's closing down the camps.
Right. And this is actually a question about the elite politics specialist. We have Victor Scher on this call, and one of the questions he has is basically asking if you detect sort of any voice of moderation in the party. And I want to sort of add to this and sort of add to the last question. And that is there any sense that they're replacing Chen because, one, there's such an uproar internationally, and so that perhaps some of that has had an effect, because we have a number of questions from the audience basically asking, what is the most effective way, or is there a way for international actors, including of course the US, to try to influence policy. But there's also the question of whether, in Beijing, there are voices urging a change.
I don't know. I wish there were. I sense that there aren't, and again, this is beyond anything I claim expertise at, but I'm not sure that Xi Jinping has surrounded himself with many people who can present different opinions. Certainly, I haven't seen anything in the sort of scholarly community of academics. It used to be a few years ago even. There would be a Xinjiang expert in a think tank in Shanghai, or maybe Guangdong, who might say, well, they're going too hard about veils. This could be counterproductive. Would actually make a comment like that to the foreign press and so on. It was gave a sense that there was at least some suggestion of different, views within the elite academic kind of sphere. But I haven't heard anything like that for a long time. And I think it's, there really isn't. This is something you can't speak up about. What people think privately, I don't know. I think though that the goal of many of these sanctions and of raising concerns and continuing to raise concerns in different forums and so on is, first of all, since I think you can't not raise these concerns, right? I mean, I don't think we need to decouple or I think the US-China relationship needs to stay on the rails. You have to compartmentalize to a certain point. But at the same time, you cannot not, for example, I think the decision to diplomatically boycott the Olympics was a good one, right? Because it makes the point, you can't go on, business cannot go on as usual. I think, it's hard to see whether, there's not a case where there's a lever that can be pushed and suddenly these policies will be changed, right? That's not how China works, and that's certainly not how the situation works. And it's not a case where there'll be such economic pain that the CCP will buckle under to US pressure. Obviously, politically, that would be impossible. However, I think there's actually more material leverage here than can easily be seen, simply because Xinjiang has been expensive to govern, as I mentioned, since the Qing Empire, and entirely through the entire period of the PRC, it is as well. And in fact, the subsidies increased over the last few years in order to build all of these camps and to invest in this. It is not inexpensive to manage Xinjiang. One of the reasons that cotton has been brought in, into this, and it has become such an important part of the debate over this, cotton textiles, cotton apparel to a certain extent, but certainly raw cotton, is because over the last 15, 20 years, cotton growing has migrated from Eastern China to Xinjiang massively. 80% is now there. But not just cotton manufacturing, also the spindles, also the spinning, right? The initial stages of this have moved massively from the East. And if you think about this economically in terms of, the value chain, right? It looks quite clearly to be part of a process whereby, where's the cheap labor left? Well, the cheap labor, is more and more inland, and now it's in Xinjiang, right? And so this is an effort to kind of, this is where the textile industry has moved or is moving in China, not entirely, of course, but increasingly into Xinjiang. And now we're seeing that everything is being entangled, and even some Eastern firms and larger firms and global clothing manufacturers are being entangled in this problem. And so even though the import bans by the United States and so on, it's going to be impossible to catch all Xinjiang cotton, particularly if they're in clothing made in Bangladesh or Vietnam, which is often the case as well. But simply putting firms on notice about that and creating incentives to migrate out of that, I think could have a serious effect economically inside China, raising the costs of these policies, or at least certainly making it more difficult to do.
Right. And also, just on a methodological note, one of the questioners wants to just, if you would say a bit, I know you can't, difficult to say all of it, but how you know what you know. So, what are the sources that are most informative if one really wants to dig into what's happening? Yeah.
This is a really interesting question, because some of you may have seen an article in the Wire China, which is this kind of China Relay news magazine recently, on open source research, which is something that so many of us now that we don't have access to going to China are beginning to do. And it's been extremely important. Now that includes satellite photography, but it includes a lot of just looking at websites, county level websites, reading Chinese media. And by far, most of the information about all this has actually come out from those sorts of open sources. There's been some leaked documents. There's been the satellite photography, which lets you see the camps, and some other things like that. Requires interpretation and so on. But the really big discovery here is how much you can learn simply by reading what is said in Chinese media, reading what is said in county level and other sorts of documents. When you can get the speeches, reading those, tracing keywords and key phrases that show up more generally later. If you can trace those back to earlier speeches, sometimes you can simply do the searches on those phrases and it will take you, you can see the lineage of policy ideas, right, in that. So a whole new set of these methodologies have been emerging around this issue.
But does this also suggest that there are actually diverse voices, within China, if you have this information coming out?
In this case, it hasn't been terribly diverse. It's been diverse, perhaps, in the sense that now and then somebody says something they probably shouldn't have, or that gets on a website for a while, and but it's kind of the expression, and I should say, a lot of this has been scrubbed, right? Since researchers have found it and published it, it disappears. But expression of what the mandates mean or what the policy lines mean, on a local level and so there was in the early stages a certain amount of local divergence, as you see with any policy implementation, right? This period of experimentation. So in some areas, the ban on veils or on hijabs was extended to regular old headscarves and even to the men's melon caps, right? In other places it wasn't, right? So you see these sort of different interpretations. But then later it comes back in, it's a standardized form, and then you can see how it's much more universally normalized as it's implemented.
There's also a clarification question from Don Emerson. He says, fascinating remarks. I believe you said that one should not have been surprised that Muslim countries have not been more critical of China's repression of the Uyghurs, and that such surprise reflects a misunderstanding of Islam. He says, can you clarify what that misunderstanding is?
Yeah, so what I mean by that is, first of all, we shouldn't expect, Islam is not a church like the Catholic Church, which has a Vatican that can lay down or a council of bishops that can pronounce what policy is, right? It is decentralized in that sense. And so the idea that there would be one Muslim response to this, it's obviously that idea comes from Salman Rushdie reactions and Danish cartoonists and those kind of things, where we did get this sense in the West that there's this kind of universal announcement from the Islamic world. But it also, I think, goes back to kind of, frankly, Orientalist senses about, Islamic fanaticism, that they will, all kind of rise up about this insult to the religion. So I think it might be kind of, sort of a naive expectation. But more than that, though, it fails to recognize that, well, there are Arabs, and then there are non-Arabs, and there are Arabs, and there are Iranians, and there are Turkic and other kinds of Muslims out there. And the fact that Uyghurs are not Arabs makes a difference, right? They're not understood. I mean, Ryan Thum has traveled around in parts of the Middle East, and people until very recently didn't know who Uyghurs were. They didn't know that they existed. And so there's very little consciousness about Chinese Muslims generally and Uyghurs after that. So I think you take into account all of these kinds of ethnic differences among people in Islam, and of course, yes, the political relationships of these countries with China. That's obviously important too. But so I don't mean to say it's not hypocritical of Muslim or majority countries, perhaps. But I think the main, as I said, the common denominator is authoritarianism in the non-response to what's happening. It's not Islam.
Okay, let me, there's a question that's come in about the Binh Tuan. And I'm also very interested in this because it goes back, because the Binh Tuan now has been associated with, these camps, and also with some of the, the forced labor and such. But, and you mentioned the Binh Tuan early in your presentation. And, obviously, a lot more about this, but the Binh Tuan, their role has really evolved. I mean, and from what I understand, like particularly in the 50s and, during the Mao period, that they really were separated. Because I know in your book, you talk about them and how they get, they're like sucking in all these resources, and they're doing, their conditions are so much better than the local people. But the fact that they were separated, what do you think about that? And that they were not competing with the locals, versus as time goes on, more Han come in. So you have Han who are in the Binh Tuan, in addition to Han who are now, migrating from the interior of China. And so what about the fact that you've got now much more direct competition between the Han and the Uyghurs, and this of course comes along with what you talk about, the opening of the West programs.
Yeah, so I mean, the Binh Tuan has always had preferable access to land and water and funding, right? And healthcare and pensions and education and all that kind of thing in their enclaves. One thing that's happened more recently has been kind of the southern movement of Binh Tuan operations. Right, so most of the early Binh Tuan were in the north. They were in this kind of line of settlements north of Urumqi. Shahedza is a Binh Tuan town, right? And by the way, Tom Cliff has a book called Oil and Water.
Right, that's very good.
Really good about this. But increasingly, there have been new ones being built in southern Xinjiang as well. And so this, then, as you say, the contrast between Binh Tuan settlements and villages and towns is more clear. Very interesting article by a Chinese scholar, Bao Manjun. I'm sorry, I have him in my notes of my book. I'm getting his name wrong, but and I actually did something which I hate when it happens to me, but I took his article and I put it on my Medium site, because I was afraid it was going to disappear. but really interesting study. And he has a book in Chinese of that. And he was embedded he was sent by the organization department from Beijing to go study inefficiencies and so on. And he wrote a very direct, straightforward critique of all of the problems, and including problems of resentment of all of the good conditions that the Bingtuan has. The policies of urbanization nationwide in China, of course, have involved all sorts of things, but they've involved building of new cities or peri-urban environments. The Bingtuan has been one of the exponents doing that, but that building has largely been for new settlements, but often abutting undeveloped villages and towns in southern Xinjiang. So, and of course, the Bingtuan is international, and they seem to have a lot of shell companies and financial dealings all around the world. I actually think, because it is both an economic organization, a commercial organization, and a settlement organization, but is also involved in the carceral system in the region, and has been all along. Not just the recent camps, but the Xinjiang Gulag. Well, that may be too strong a word, but the prisons there, which and labor reform camps, for decades. That's a real liability, I think, for Xinjiang and for the Bingtuan and for the CCP state, actually, because their economic activities sooner or later will always be connected with their carceral activities. And this is one of the things that happened to the Eskel company, this global shirt maker, it's the largest shirt maker in the world. They have integrated involvement with Xinjiang from the field through factories all the way out to sales to Hugo Boss and Tommy Hilfiger and other international brands. But their joint partnership was with a Bingtuan subsidiary.
Interesting.
And so they ended up on the US entities list. Right. I think they've got themselves off of it through some very expensive lobbying efforts. But they were sort of shamed of that early on, because of that connection with the Bingtuan, and they've sold their interest and moved out of their interest with the Bingtuan for that reason. But I think it's a big liability, actually, for the party in PRC.
Well, we're already over time, and we've got a lot of questions. I want to thank the audience for these great questions. And unfortunately, we're not able to get them all, but I want to thank you for incredibly, I think, thoughtful and talk and very informative. These are clearly very complicated issues, but I think you've given us a lot of very rich insights to think about. So thank you very much. And, thank the audience. And we hope to see you again for our next China program event. We're going to go back to much more mundane topics. We're going to go back to the future of Chinese economy on February 9th. And actually, I'm going to be the speaker talking about Chinese local government debt. But thank you again, Jim. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you. Bye-bye.